Juliet, welcome. I'm so excited to do an entire conversation on the most overlooked element of the garden sometimes, which is soil.
I know. Who knew that there was so much to talk about in soil?
I was reading your book and I was like, gosh, there's so much. I mean, even just your section on how to measure your own soil, I was like, dang, there is so much to dive into here. Before we dive into the concept of soil, you are such an accomplished gardener and author. Can you tell us how you became the plant lady that you are today?
Oh, well, it was quite a journey, really. My first career was in medicine. I was a doctor first of all, but I'd always gardened. Yeah. So science was my sort of first love, but I'd
Okay.
always gardened since a child and really enjoyed that. And I loved the creativity of it and the sort of working with nature and the idea that you do something but you don't quite know whether it's going to work. There's nature always has a hand in it. So I changed careers about 30 years ago. I changed careers and concentrated on horticulture and designing gardens for people.
I'm jealous of British culture because gardening is so intrinsic to who you are. Like, I feel like I've yet to interview someone from England who was disconnected to plants as a kid. I mean, I feel like everybody has gardening in their blood, where on the American side, we have to kind of work to claim it sometimes, which is interesting.
Yeah.
I'm so jealous.
Yes. I think so many children grow up with parents and grandparents taking them out into the garden, sometimes slightly forced to work in the garden. But I've always say that I think if children have that initial fascination with gardens and landscape, they may move away from it, particularly in their teenage years, but then you come back to it, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, I think about my childhood, and there was actually not that much interest in the plants, but there was a lot of interest in the dirt because dirt
Yes.
with water comes mud. And we used to like make mud pies, and we would have we would call them fiestas, where we would just like make all these weird mud patties and concoctions of soil and different versions of hydration. Why have you chosen to focus on soil so much in your writing? This is now clicking. It's making so much sense that you're in medicine because you write about soil with such a clinical approach, I think, with
Well,
reverence too. But why has soil been so important in your gardening
yeah,
journey?
you're absolutely right. One of the things that fascinates me about soil is that it is that wonderful mix of science and creativity.
Mm,
So when I started to get to know more about soil and also realized how little we know about soil, I was fascinated to understand more of
yeah.
the science. But of course, it's essential to what we grow in the garden. And also there is the whole creative side. There are soil artists who paint with soil and
Mm.
people who sculpt with soil. So it's that sort of junction between creativity and science. I think often the most exciting things happen at the junction of two worlds, and that's why I'm so fascinated with soil. But I think I first really started to think about it when I visited my family. I've got extended family in Tanzania, East Africa. And
Hmm.
I realized that their soil was depleted, really. They explained to me that their crops had been failing year on year. And when I looked at the soil, it was dry and sandy, and it seemed to have no goodness in it at all. And that was confirmed when I tested it. And I started to realize how important soil is for the nourishment of plants, and therefore for the nourishment of animals, and ultimately people need our soil to be healthy.
Yeah, it's interesting. We talk about the concept of plant blindness on the show a lot. And I think it goes even farther, soil blindness, right? Because a part of why I enjoyed reading your book so much was I was fortunate enough to take a soil science class at New York Botanical Garden in the pandemic. It was expensive class, big investment, big, and a lot of work, right? A lot of work, a lot of homework. But as I was reading your book, I was like, oh my God, this is the soil science class, like where you talk about all of the things that get, when I think soil, I think brown. I think like brown dirt, right? Like that's what I think. I'm not thinking about all of the different components that make up soil. I'm not thinking about all of the different organisms living in soil. I'm not thinking about how it really is this whole organism that, not organism, environment. And because of that, I think a lot of people ignore it and don't pay attention to it and then get to the point where it's depleted. So what did you do once you tested the soil and you realized the depletion in the soil in your family's home? Were you able to remediate it at all?
Well, we tried. We told them about looking after the soil, about composting, and about using animal manures to improve the soil. The problem there is that they've actually got very little to start with because their crops are so depleted. They haven't really got much to rot down to make the compost, so they can't even start that beneficial cycle, which is really tricky. So it takes a long once you get to that stage where things are bad, it takes a long time to grow enough to have the waste organic matter to then improve your soil and get things going. So I suppose the lesson in that is to try and look after your soil before that happens.
Yeah, and that's why the title of this episode is Gardening for Soil, right? So we're growing our soil this season as much as we're growing our plants. Before we dive into compost, obviously, which is going to be what everybody wants to talk about, I want to go back because I felt like your book was such a fun opportunity to like dig even deeper to what soil is. So can we talk about what the different components of soil are? Because I have a feeling a lot of people listening have not thought about it this granularly.
Yes. Well, what I was trying to do in the book was to give everybody enough theoretical information to be able to make decisions in their own gardens, but not to get too bogged down in it. So to give you an idea of what soil comprises, I suppose. So you have the topsoil, which is the top layer that most of us are digging about in our gardens. And that's where really all the action happens. It's where most of the roots of the plants are, where most of the animals and the creepy crawlies live, and where most of the goodness is in the topsoil. And that sits on top of what we call the subsoil, which has less organic matter in it, less life in it. And that subsoil basically comes from the bedrock beneath. And as the bedrock gets worn away by the action of animals and climate, it sort of becomes ground down into subsoil. Then as plants and animals die and their remains are added in, and the goodness of their remains are added in, that then becomes the topsoil. So you have these layers happening within the soil. And if we think about topsoil first, topsoil has a combination of inorganic matter. So that's the sort of things like little rock particles, all the minerals like potassium and phosphorus. That's the non-living part, I suppose. But then the topsoil also has the organic matter, which is the living part. And that's basically animals and plants, either dead or alive. So soil is a mix of inorganic stuff and living or dead organic stuff.
Yeah, I feel like we think of soil as the organic stuff because that's like really what's the brown, right? Like the decomposing, organic matter. But it's such a small part. It's such a small part of what's going on in our gardens.
Yeah.
The mineral aspect of soil is rocks that have been broken down over time, yeah?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating because if we see a fossil in a museum or we find a fossil by the seaside or something, we're fascinated because it's millions and millions of years old. But our soil, just the stuff that we walk over every day, has tiny little rock particles that have ground down, and that's millions, thousands, zillions of years old. But we think nothing of it. So you're right. Over time, what happens is the rocks get ground down by the action of frost and rain and heat, all sort of cracking and weathering away the rock. And it gets ground down into tiny little particles which become part of the soil. And within those particles are the elements that we need and plants need to survive. So things like the potassium and the phosphorus that go to make up our bodies ultimately come from rocks.
Yeah. Can you speak about too the importance of air and water when it comes to soil? That was another fact that kind of blew my mind. How much of soil is air pockets?
Yes. So as you say, we think of soil as being this sort of, mushy brown stuff. And we think of it as being really a sort of homogeneous mix. But it's actually very structured. I've spoken already about the layers within soil. But then if you go down sort of deep down and look on a microscopic level, the different sized particles in soil are held together in clumps or aggregates. And in between the particles are air pockets. And actually, those air pockets in a healthy soil, those air pockets make up a great proportion of the soil. So actually the soil, if it's healthy, has lots of air in it, all mixed up with the particles. And of course, when it rains, or if we water our gardens, the water moves through the air pockets and around the soil particles. And so when you sort of, for example, if you water a flower pot full of compost and soil and the water drains out of the bottom of the flower pot, it's trickling through those air pockets between soil particles and then out of the bottom. And that's how a healthy soil doesn't get waterlogged, because the water is able to travel through the soil under gravity.
Yeah, I was watering some houseplants today. I always marvel at the difference in weight of a pot pre-water and post-water. And it's because even after the water has drained out the bottom of the pot, the soil has absorbed the water and it's so much heavier. And it really does go to show you there's a reason why when your plants are looking a little limp and the soil looks like totally shriveled and shrunken, there's a totally kind of different energy to it. As gardeners, we're looking at topsoil, right? Because if we're gardening in ground, we're looking at amending or dealing with the topsoil that we're planting our plants in. There are very few plants that we're putting in that are going to go beyond there. So what do I need to be thinking about when, say it's my first year gardening in a new house and I'm looking at my soil and I want to do in-ground gardens, I want to do some landscaping. What are the elements of soil that I need to be looking at when it comes to approaching it from the lens of a gardener?
Yeah, wow. So I always think when you're starting a new garden or moving to a new property, the first thing to do is just look. Just spend some time getting to know your garden. Don't be too quick to sort of rush in there with your fork and start churning things about. So have a look at your soil and really get to understand it. And before you even look at the soil itself, look at the plants that are already growing there, and also the plants that are growing around your garden, in other people's gardens, and in the wilder landscape around your garden, because those plants will tell you a lot about what sort of soil you've got. Not just the sort of cultivated garden plants, but even the weeds will tell you, is your soil compacted, or does your soil like supporting acid-loving plants, those sort of things. So once you've had a look at the plants that are happy in your environment, have a look at the soil itself. And again, you can tell a lot just by looking at it first of all. Is it dry and dusty? Is it dark? Usually dark coloured soil has more organic matter, and so as a general rule of thumb often has more nutrients in it. And then take a handful and feel it. So does it feel moist? Is it holding water, or is it sort of blow away dry? And then rub it between your fingers. If it feels gritty, then it's probably got sand in it. If it feels squidgy like clay, like potter's clay, then it has clay in it. And so you can tell even before you start sort of formally testing, just with the senses that you have, you can get to know a lot about your soil. But then the next thing I think is to, with some simple kits, do a little bit of testing. You can test the acidity or the alkalinity of your soil. I don't know, Maria, if you had the same, but at school we did acid and alkaline tests on things. So you can buy a kit really easily in the garden centre and test whether your soil is acid or alkaline.
Oh, and it's so fun. You feel like a little scientist as
I
you
know.
get the little kit. I grow hydroponically and I have very alkaline water here. And so every week I have to go test the water, and then I have to put the pH down, and then I have to do it again. And it's so fun. It's so fun.
And then you can do what's called a sedimentation test, where you basically get your soil, shake it up with some water until it's all brown and mixed in with the water. And then you wait for it to settle, and you time, because it will settle in different layers. So the heavy particles, the sand, will settle first within minutes, and then the clay will settle, and then the silt will settle, and you can time, and that way you can work out how much sandy stuff, how much clay, and how much of the very, very fine silt particles you've got in your soil.
Yeah, I need to do that here because my audience knows I moved 1,500 miles. So zone 5B to zone 10B, I moved from New York to Florida. My soil in New York was glorious, beautiful loam situation. However, there were large rocks. So I was dealing with a lot of rocks when I was digging it up, but great, beautiful organic matter Perfect. Now in Florida, I'm walking in my backyard. I'm walking in sand. It's like I'm almost at the beach in my backyard. Like I cannot get over the difference in composition of the soil in the same country, right? I'm in the same country, but the makeup of the soil is completely different. And when I was reading about that test in your book, I was like, oh my God, I bet if I tested my soil, it would be like 99% sand and 1% everything else.
Yeah.
But like you were saying, this is a very simple thing that you can do. So you get a mason jar, you get a third of the mason jar you're going to put your soil from your front yard or backyard in, and then 2 parts water. You shake it up just like Juliet said, and then you time it. And because the particles are different weights are different, the particles are different weights. Sand settles first, then like you said, silt. No, silt is the last. What's in the middle? Clay. And so a lot of people have issues when they're gardening that they have too much clay in their soil. And so they have to amend for the clay. I'm going to have too much sand. I'm going to have to amend for the sand. I'm not going to grow in ground, frankly, in Florida. I'm only doing raised bed gardening here. But it's so interesting. So can you talk about the components of, I think gardeners talk about loam a lot. And once you identify through your testing, if you have too much sand, if you have too much clay, if you have too much silt, then what adjustments you should be making to further the healthiness of your soil for your garden.
Yeah, so if you look at any soil science book, you'll see this triangle of the different components of soil. And basically the 3 main ones, sand, silt and clay, occur in different mixes in the various parts of the country or the world. And so as you say, if you've got mostly sand, you'll have sort of, mostly sand, a little bit of clay, a little bit of silt, or you can have mostly clay and a little bit of sand. If you've got a beautiful equal amount of each, this is the sort of nirvana that everybody wants to achieve. That sweet spot in the middle is called loam, and everybody wants loamy soil because it's got the nutrients of clay, but it's workable and it's just lovely stuff. But most people are somewhere out towards the edges and don't have that. And the traditional way of ameliorating or improving your soil is basically to add organic matter, because the more organic matter you have, the healthier your soil is, really. It adds living organisms in the form of bacteria and microscopic mini beasts, and makes your soil alive, really. But it also adds fibre, sort of living fibre from the plants that have rotted down, becomes organic matter, and that improves your soil. Now that's the traditional thing to think about. So you would add organic matter to clay soil, but also you, Maria, would add organic matter to your sandy soil to improve it.
So
it
compost,
really is
organic matter ends up being the end result.
It does. But I would say that things are changing, and scientists are now talking more about whether we really should be interfering quite so much with our soil. So it's a new idea, but I'm going to put it to you and your listeners.
Please do.
That you may like to think about alternatives to adding organic matter. Alternative ways of gardening. Now, before I explain a little more about this, I would say that we have to think, first of all, what are we trying to grow? So if you're trying to grow vegetables, or you're trying to grow big, blousy flowers for competition, then you will need to improve your soil. You will need to add organic matter. So that's a sort of very productive side of gardening. You're really wanting to beef things up, get big tomatoes and big dahlias, big chrysanthemums. But if you want to be, I suppose, less interfering in your soil, and I suppose in a way respect the ecosystem that is already there, the structure of the soil, the complex web of life that's going on in your soil, you can take a step back and think, well, actually, what would nature be doing to this soil if I wasn't here? Nature would be growing plants, but they may not be the sort of blousy garden-esque plants that we think of growing. They would be the kind of plants that are just growing outside your garden in the landscape. And so the question I'd like to put to you and to your listeners is, can we change our tastes? Can we think about growing plants that are better adapted to the sort of soil that we've got, and making ornamental, pleasing gardens out of those sort of adapted plants? What do you think?
Yeah, native. I mean, so I know native is kind of like a triggering word for people these days in the gardening space, but more native plants. So, like, I'm walking around Florida and I'm seeing palm trees and plants that are extremely heat resistant, plants that can handle a lot of moisture. You know, the grass in Florida is different grass than the grass in New York.
Mm.
And so instead of trying to force my dahlias that I used to grow in New York really easily, don't do that. You know, actually, my number one tip for people that have moved, like a really dramatic move that I have, is going to the local nurseries.
Yes.
Because I wanted to plant a pollinator garden, but I went to the local nursery and I was like, okay, what are the pollinators for this area, the native pollinators? And I ended up planting plants I've never grown before because I don't know what tick seed is. Like, it's the state flower of Florida. I had no idea what it was. Now I'm growing it. It's very happy here, you know? So I also feel like when you consider more native plants, like what you're saying, you're also kind of setting yourself up for more success because those plants are designed to thrive here anyway.
Absolutely.
And then I also feel like, and obviously this isn't the most affordable option for people, and I want to name that, but like, I love growing vegetables. But for me, growing vegetables in a raised bed that I can completely control the, you know, potting media that I put in it, and it can be compost and it can, you know, just be what it needs to be. It's like a little bit more controlled. For me, that feels like making more sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really think it's about understanding what the soil is. Understanding the effect that we have on it when we, you know, when we dig it, when we add organic matter, we change it drastically. And that's just a decision for us to make. So as you say, if you want to have lots of success with vegetables, maybe the thing is, you know, raised beds, raise above your claggy soil or raise above your sand and use lots of sort of yummy compost and lots and lots of nutrients. But then maybe in the rest of the garden where you're doing ornamental gardening, think about more adapted plants. And yes, native plants, but also you can think wider, you know, to a wider palette of plants that are still adapted. So they may not actually be Florida natives, but adapted to that sort of...
But adapted. Yeah, totally. Or even, you know, tomatoes, for example. There were tomatoes that I grew in New York, but now as I'm leaning into my Floridian plant lady community, there are specific tomatoes that do really well here because they're more heat resistant. Swamp tomatoes is one of them. They're like little cherry tomatoes, but they like thrive in the swamp, you know, and it's like really interesting. So there's like little rifts. It's like, yes, I could still grow tomatoes, but maybe could I grow something a little bit more adapted? Now, I do have to ask you because you are the soil expert and we have a lot of vegetable gardeners listening. We have a lot of beginner gardeners listening who do want the dahlias and they do want the flowers. So what are, I guess, the least invasive ways that we can amend and set our soil up for success?
Yeah. Okay. So if you want to beef up your soil, as I said, it is very much about organic matter. That's, you know, it's like this miracle stuff. And organic matter is basically anything that used to be a living plant that has now died and rotted down. So you might say, well, how does that work for horse manure? But if you think about it, horse manure used to be a plant because the horse ate the grass, it went through the horse's body, came out the other end. So it is plants, but it's digested and rotted plants. So anything like manures, of course, garden compost, if you can make your own, that's fabulous. Rotted seaweed, spent hops, spent mushroom compost, all those sort of things that used to be a plant, that's what your soil needs. Now, again, in the old days, we would dig and dig deeply, you know, double digging 60 centimeters or I suppose you would call that 2 foot down into the ground. But actually, if you think about it, isn't that what worms do all day? So we can, if we want to, use the no dig technique. Which is basically where you lay the organic matter on the top of the soil and you just wait for the rain and the worms to do the back-breaking job of getting it down into the soil. The only downside is it takes longer. Yeah. You have to be patient. But by letting the worms and the creepy crawlies do the job for you, you're not churning over those layers. Remember I talked about the topsoil, the subsoil, the layers within. Every time you dig, you're disrupting that. But if you let the worms do it, they do it slowly and gently, and they don't disrupt the whole ecosystem. Because, if you think about the creepy crawlies in the soil, they like to live at the depth that they like to live.
Mm-hmm.
Different worms will be at different depths. Wood lice will be nearer the top. Nematodes will be further down. And so every time we dig, we're literally turning their world upside down. Imagine. A bit sad.
I think about, because back in the day, like I think about my mom, she's an amazing gardener. She comes from a lineage of gardeners and farmers. She was like Little Miss Till. Like she would go rent the till, the tilling machine from Home Depot, and she would just tear her lawn up and make beds all the time because that's what used to be advised, right? Like to till
Absolutely.
and amend your soil. And now it's so interesting that that now that we have a better understanding of the earth, how like when you till, you're really disrupting this web of organisms that have been living in community with each other. And it is like you're just ripping them out of their home. Is it okay? So say I do a soil test and I realize I have like really I have like bad soil. Can I just put enough compost on top of the bad soil and plant my plants basically into the compost layer, trusting that the compost will eventually go down into the garden beds and make it more workable?
Yes, you can. So now we have to be careful with our use of the word compost here.
Okay.
Because compost it's used a sort of a bit freely to mean different things. So it can, some people use the word compost to mean garden compost. So, you're rotting, what you've got rotting down in the corner of the garden, but you wouldn't plant seeds into that.
Mm-hmm.
Other people will use compost to mean the bagged stuff.
I'm thinking
you buy.
Bagged compost.
Yeah,
that's like ready to be used in the garden.
Exactly. So that you could put that on the surface of your soil and then you can plant your seeds into that. Yes. Okay. And it'll work its way through. Some people use cardboard, which is a great idea. So if you've got, say, for example, you've got an old lawn, a patch of grass, and you want to turn that into vegetable beds, you don't have to dig. You just cut the grass, put a layer of cardboard down on top of the grass, and then put your layer of compost on top of the cardboard and plant your seeds into that pile of compost. And of course, the cardboard being paper, organic material, will rot down. So it'll rot down, but while it's rotting, it's smothering and killing the grass and the weeds underneath.
And the weeds.
The weeds, yeah. So you don't have to dig. The only thing I would say is that, of course, it'll take time for that cardboard to rot. So you don't want to be planting something like potatoes that need to get their roots down deep because they won't be able to get through the cardboard in the first, for a few weeks. So you'd start off with smaller things like lettuces, radishes, things like that. And then after a few weeks, the cardboard will have rotted. And then you can actually plant the deeper rooting stuff.
Don't start with carrots or something that needs to keep growing down.
They'll end up bent.
They'll bend, right. They'll like take a 90-degree turn right at the paper. What about, I know we're coming up to time, but what about the main nutrients that we need to think about in the garden and what to keep our eye out for?
So there are lots and lots of nutrients that plants need and that animals and human beings need. But the main ones, the macronutrients that are needed in greater quantities are potassium, phosphorus and nitrogen. And some people say magnesium. And those, as I said, they come ultimately, they derive from rocks. The nitrogen actually ultimately comes from the air, but we probably haven't got time to go into all that. Those are what plants need in the right balance for that plant. And, Mother Nature is fantastic because plants have a way of getting what they need with the help of bacteria in the soil. They have a way of getting what they need from the soil. But sometimes things are not quite right and you get imbalances in nutrients, and that's when your plants start to struggle. And you might find yellowing of the leaves, or perhaps the buds don't form, or the leaves are slightly small or distorted. And again, in the old days, we would rush to get the bottle of fertilizer or the box of fertilizer and start sprinkling it on. But actually, the best way, the soil scientists now tell us, is to look after the soil. If you feed the soil rather than feed the plants, then the plants sort of work it out for themselves. So again, organic matter and a healthy soil, most situations will do the job.
I love this. Now, I mean, composting is getting easier than ever, like with all of the different composting contraptions that you can have. They have tabletop composters now. The first types of tabletop composters are more just like dehydrating your food, but now they actually are adding organic mat. Like it's really interesting. Composting is really becoming way more mainstream.
Yeah, and wormeries, small wormeries.
Yeah.
Which
People
are
have
great.
worms under their sink, like a tub full of worms under their sink now. It's wild.
It's really good.
It
and
really is
hot
crazy.
composters. Do you have hot composters?
Me, no, personally, no, but I know that they're definitely available. And there's so many different ways. I also love, my bag of Espoma organic compost, the mushroom compost or the land and sea compost. That's where I'm still at. I don't have I rent, so I don't have complete control over my land yet. So I'm very much still a raised garden bed, container gardener, what's easiest, what's not disrupting my land.
But that's the great thing, isn't it? There's so many different ways that you can do it. Something to suit everybody's lifestyle. Not everybody has the time for, turning from one bay into another and then into another bay, or the space to do that. But there are so many different ways, convenient ways that you can do it. Yeah.
You are such a resource, and your book really is a wonderful. It's not a textbook because it's enjoyable to read and it's easy to get through. It's not the textbook that I read in my soil science class, but it's so much more. It's really a very unique book in how rich it is in information. And I can see myself going back to it over and over again every year, as I continue to develop my soil. So where can people find your book? And also where can people find you if they want to learn more from you?
Well, yeah. So my book, it comes out at the end of April in the US and the beginning of May in the UK and Europe. But if you pre-order it on Amazon or other online booksellers, then you get a discount. So
Perfect.
I advise pre-order. And then I have a website, www.julietsargeant.com, which tells you more about me and the gardens that I design. And I also run the Sussex Garden School, which is www.sussexgardenschool.com, where we teach all things creative for the garden, actually. So gardening and garden design, but also craft, because I think gardens are a wonderful way to be creative and inspired to do creative things.
Oh my God, I wish I lived in Sussex just so I could come be your student. That sounds like so much fun. You are a delight. We'll make sure to link the book and your website and the school in the show notes. People, everybody go find Juliet. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. And happy gardening.